Thank you for that. Thank you that we're not alone in this room. We have each other, and that's a friendship, a bond that you grant us because of our relationship with you. And we just want to thank you. We come with minds and hearts that are not always clean. You know the temptations that come our way, and you know the things we yield to. Lord, you know us intimately. Not only what we do, but what we think. And Lord, that we come to you knowing we need your cleansing, we need your forgiveness, we need your work in our hearts and our lives. And we welcome you, Lord, this morning to do your good work in us. We come with open hearts to you, Lord. Teach us. Pray, Lord, that you would build into our hearts and lives the confidence that we show in the way we live our life. So we ask today, Lord, that you give us minds and hearts that can hear from you and can apply and understand your word. Give me clarity, Lord, even as I speak, that by your Spirit you would inspire all of us, encourage all of us, hold us accountable, Lord. Grant us a straight path in life that produces good fruit, good things. We come in need of you and grateful for your welcome and our coming into your presence. So we come in Jesus, and in his name, amen. Well, I am glad to be with you here this morning. There's some times when I'm preparing here that I'm reading through the chapter and I says, seems like I've read this before. And there's a lot of repetition of sorts, but there's just nuances in the way that Solomon expresses principles of life that he's given to his sons in each of those parables. And what I've given you there are 5 pieces of paper. The top one is really fine print, but that's the whole chapter on one page. If you have a glass that you can look through that makes it look bigger, that would be helpful probably. But and then you've got 4 pages of track with me through the notes as I'm going through. Today's text, chapter 19. Begins by describing the life of the poor and the contrast between the foolish and the wise. And I plan to present 3 major themes out of this chapter today. 1 is the poor, 2 are the foolish, and 3 are the wise. And I think the presentation that and it's almost in that order as we go through. If you look at the first page, I color-coded the themes of poor, foolish, wise, the things that God does in our lives. But if you looked at the color code, you see sort of the orangey color. That's in my color code. Those are the verses that address wisdom. And I know if you look at the color code, looking through the sheet, you see that the orangey color shows up. It's like it's woven through the whole chapter. And here he is presenting wisdom, and he's presenting foolishness, and he's laced in all of the foolishness is there. He laces his wisdom and the value of doing what God calls us to do and to be. And so I pulled out those 3 themes, and we'll be working with those, but working through the entire chapter as we do that. But I just want to explain to you where I'm headed this morning. There are 5 characteristics that are contrasted here: the poor, the blameless, the fool, and the perverse, and the wise. And so I'm looking at verse 1. And we'll be looking here, first of all, to the descriptions of the poor man in chapter 19. In verse 1 it says, "Better a poor man whose walk is blameless than a fool whose lips are perverse. It is not good to have zeal without knowledge, nor to be hasty and miss the way." And I wanted you to see these 5 characteristics in this. You have the poor man, and we'll find bigger definition coming up here. But the poor man whose walk is blameless. He would fall in the category we've been reading about in prior Proverbs of being the righteous. Poor but righteous. There's nothing to blame him for. He's blameless. He lives a good life. He just happens to be poor. He doesn't have a lot of resources. He doesn't have a lot of engagement. And we look and say he is poor. He may say with his own lips, I'm a poor man. But his life is right and pure before God. He's blameless. And he said, it's better to be a poor man who lives a good life than to be a fool whose lips are perverse. And perverse means to stubbornly oppose what is right, reasonable, and accepted. Perverse is someone whose life values are twisted. And said it's better to be a poor man and be righteous than it is to be a fool whose lips are perverse, twisted. And then I like this. It's not good to have zeal. That's excitement, passion about something. It's not good to have zeal without knowledge, without understanding. Somewhere in this, wisdom plays a part in life. And I can be all excited about doing something and be headed down a wrong path because I'm not thinking about what do I need to know to do what I'd like to accomplish. So zeal without knowledge is not good. Nor is it too good to be hasty and miss the way. Get in a hurry and miss your turnoff if you're traveling down the freeway. I would never do a thing like that. Unless maybe it was the day before yesterday. How many times did I have to turn around, U-turn on that? I kept, well, it was in conversation, you know, I was doing something else and it's like I was hasty and I missed the way. So his point here, it's not good to have zeal without knowledge. Knowledge is an important thing. Know where you're going, know what's going on around you. Be aware, be conscious, and be thoughtful. Take your time, at least enough that you don't miss your way. So those are the first couple of verses there of the chapter. But it starts with better to be a poor man than blameless, and blameless than to be a fool and have to be twisted. I said, better a poor man whose walk is blameless. And the blameless is contrasted with the fool's man whose lips is perverse or not trustworthy. It's better to be a poor man who lives rightly than to live a life that's not trustworthy. This is followed in verses 4 and 6, 7 with something that is, in my mind, sad, but a true description of what is poor. In verse 4, it says, wealth brings many friends, but a poor man's friend deserts him. I don't know that I comprehend that fully. I don't necessarily make divisions among people as to their financial resources. People are people. I think maybe because out of the core of Scripture, I find we're all level before the cross. You know, what we have or don't have, or what we've accomplished or not accomplished, or what our age, whatever. Before the cross of Christ, we're all level. We're all equal. We all have one thing in common. We're in desperate need of God's forgiveness and His grace, His mercy in our lives. And all the other factors of life don't play. And so I tend to to see people as equal in that sense. as human beings in need of God's grace and mercy. And I want to represent that in the lives of people that I meet. I'd like to be gracious and merciful and forgiving and understanding and encouraging with whoever I meet, whatever their status in life. But that's not the culture we live in. The culture we live in makes distinctions. And one of those distinctions is one's economic status. But I thought it was interesting that Solomon, the wealthiest man on earth, would make the statement that the poor man's in a better place than anybody else. But he observes that the wealthy have a lot of friends, but the poor man doesn't have many because he doesn't have anything to give, tangibly kinds of things to give. And his friend deserts him. In verse 6, many curry favor with a ruler. I'd heard the phrase curry before, but I thought that was an Indian seasoning, that I wasn't quite sure. But curry favor means to seek favor by flattery, by puffing up somebody else, saying really kind things, exorbitant things about somebody else. You curry favor, you seek favor by flattery. So he seeks favor with a ruler, and everyone is a friend to the man who gives gifts. What are you handing out today? I'm your friend. That kind of thing. And you would see that in our culture today. How many businesses are making offers of things? And it's interesting that I'm particularly in the internet, in the digital world. There's software out that is being sold to me as being really helpful to me in the things I want to accomplish in my life. So I take their software so it would be helpful to me, only to find that they're taking all of my data out of my computer when I load up their program. And I'm going, that's junk. I said, where in all of this is a good thing, but they offer the gift of all this help only to take. And so everyone is a friend of a man who offers gifts, unless he figures out what's really going on. And then in verse 7, we have a description further here of the poor man. He is shunned by all his relatives. How much more do his friends avoid him? Though he pursues them with pleading, he needs help. They are nowhere to be found. And so you have the description here of the poor man who is righteous and blameless, but nobody wants to be his friend because he doesn't have anything to give and he always has need. And it's interesting to me that Solomon, a wealthy man, would make this observation about humanity. The poor man is better off because he lives a clean life, he's blameless, he lives rightly before God, there's no pretense in his life, there's honesty in his life, and he says all the things that take a man down are part of the man who's foolish. The poor man is the one to be honored. I'm looking at verse 17, the last reference to poor in this chapter. He who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord. And he, God, or the Lord, will reward him for what he has done. Solomon just says that he who is kind to the poor is giving to God. I said, that was kind of a strange thought. And then I thought, it seems to me I've read that someplace else. And I wrote it in your text there, in your notes. It said in Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 34, Jesus is making this statement. It's a story he's telling. And Jesus said, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. So people standing on his right, he said, your reward in heaven is here and waiting for you. He said, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came and visited me. This is the king saying that to the righteous ones on his right. He said, you did all these things for me. You deserve the reward that's there for you. Then the righteous will say to him, Jesus was saying, but Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of these, the least of these, my brothers, you did for me. And so Jesus is telling us, the thought that came through Solomon's mind, recorded in that proverb, is endorsed and stated and illustrated here by Jesus. He said, when you help somebody else, when you help somebody in need, you're giving to me. You're giving to God. And God honors that. He's pleased when we are generous. He's pleased when we give of ourselves to help somebody else. And coming out of this illustration of poverty, the poor man has little to give, tangibly, but he has his life. He has loyalty. He has presence. I don't mean like that gifts, but I mean he's got a physical presence. And he has a voice. He can speak. And he can give. And is, when I read this, I was reminded of how many times I have been in places of the world that, from a standard of U.S. economy, extreme poverty. They eat what they grow in their garden next to their mud hut. And once in a while, they get some protein of meat of some kind. Maybe a bird, or a monkey, or a snake, or something that they may catch that they can boil up and produce some protein there for them. But they're in abject poverty in places around the world. It's in Central Africa, out in the middle of the bush, in the middle of nowhere. I was thinking Cambodia, and up on the Thai border, in the villages, the bamboo stilted houses with thatched sides, they're elevated above the ground and produce shade during the day and help cool the house in the evening. I mean, it's a lot of practical sense in the way they build and what they do, but it's like next to nothing. I could build one in my backyard. We call it a playhouse, but that's their home. And I think of, but what blew me away the first time when I walked into one of those kind of situations was to see how generous the people were in hosting us when we came to visit them in their situation. It was embarrassing to me. I said, they were giving us their very best. And I said, you don't need to do that. I couldn't say that because I need to say thank you and honor them and respect them and what they do. But it was difficult for me to receive from them because I knew how much they were giving out of their poverty. And I thought about, talk about being honored personally, but think about the honor they get from God because of their own heart and their response. They gave with what they had. And then I get back here and I think how stingy I am. This is mine. I worked hard for this money and I bought that with my money. That's mine. I got to protect everything that's mine. I said somewhere in life I picked up this statement too: the more you own, the more it owns you. And I think that marks a lot of our society. The more I own, the more I have to give attention to it, to protect it, to keep it up, to maintain it. And I said those in poverty don't know that. But when I give, I'm generous to whatever degree I can be generous to those who don't have, to see that as a gift to God. Because that's how the Scripture describes it. It's how the proverb describes it, but that's how Jesus described it in his story. Verse 22. What a man desires is unfailing love. It's better to be poor than a liar. Almost a repeat of the opening statement. It's better to be poor and blameless than to be a fool and have perverse lips, be a liar. What we see in this text, that God honors the poor, the blameless, the honest, but despises the dishonest, the arrogant, the wealthy, the arrogant wealthy. I don't want to put down wealth either. It's what do I do with what God has given me? God's given me opportunity to produce, and the rewards of that are monies, our income, and I'm responsible with that. I'm generous with that back to the Lord. I'm generous with that with those who are in need around me. But I'm responsible for it, and I take care, and I see that the funds that I have, I want to invest them in ways that will reproduce themselves in either tangible ways or in reproduce them in just an interest. But what's important about wealth is your heart. So I just needed to say that, because the statements that come across here about the poor man and the wealthy, it sounds like if you're wealthy, there's something brutal about your life. There's something that's cruel or insensitive about it. But so I just needed to address that. So it's better to be poor than a liar. I just want to make sure that I live my life honestly. Looking at verse 3, a man's own folly ruins his life, yet his heart rages against the Lord. How often do I see that? Somebody does something really thoughtless, hurtful to somebody else. It's folly, foolish, thoughtless. And somehow the consequences come back to them, that things don't work out like they're supposed to work out. I did something with my money and this, and it didn't happen the way I wanted it to happen. And I find that I invested it in poor things, or I made a poor choice in life, and I end up suffering from it. There's some ruin that comes to my life, and so I end up suffering from it. And what does the fool do? His heart rages against God. Look at what you allowed to happen to me. When in fact he generated the difficulty all himself. It's more evidence of the foolishness of the fool. Not only doesn't recognize responsibility for his own life, but blames somebody else for it. Around somebody like that this week. Out of the fool's futility, torment, he shouts at God. You bless the poor, worthless humanity, and curse me in all my accomplishments. And God says his lies will be his downfall. Verse 5 is a repeated verse in verse 5 and 9. Verse 5, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who pours out lies will not go free. In a statement that in telling a lie, you create bondage, and you won't go free from that. And then in verse 9 is the repeat, a false witness will not go unpunished. he who pours out lies will perish. So the liar in his bondage will not go free, but will be punished and will perish. Speak the truth. Whatever the cost, speak the truth. A lifestyle acquired through deceit and manipulation of others will not last. Live honestly in all your dealings. Verse 10, it is not fitting for a fool to live in luxury. How much worse for a slave to rule over princes. Foolish leadership is the downfall of a nation. I remember observing that in all of my history classes, through high school and then in college, and some of the things, just to see the decisions that are made that impact the whole nation, and the difference between one who is thoughtful and wise and one who is politically motivated and foolish, and the stuff that comes out of that. In the Proverbs that follow it, it says that foolishness is also the downfall of a family. It can be the destruction in a family. A foolish son is his father's ruin, and a quarrelsome wife is like a constant ripping. I don't know who in his family he might have been referring to, but Solomon had some understanding about a wife who's never agreeable. It is like a leaky roof. In verse 19, it follows the same. A hot-tempered man must pay the penalty. If you rescue him, you will have to do it again. Those who tend to be hot-tempered don't tend to lose it. It's a man only redeemed by God, transformed in his life because of his submission and in pursuit of the Lord, that temper can be gone. And I'm finding that this is, I have been, my reputation personally, with people who know me time, I'm kind, I'm gentle, I'm easy, I'm caring. But I'm finding as I add age to my body and pain becomes a constant companion, that I'm sometimes, my temper is not what it should be, could be, ought to be. And so I have to guard my heart in the conditions of the situations of my life, that hot-tempered. I'd rather be like the man who will be described here in a bit, the one who is content where he's at in life, has an understanding of the world that he lives in. But we find that it's not fitting for a fool to live in verse 10, it's not fitting for a fool to live in luxury, because he doesn't know how to handle it, doesn't know how to live with it. And it's compared to someone who is a slave and becomes the leader of princes. And he has no savvy in terms of relationships or leading and what's going on, and he does so with resentment to those who put him down before. He said that's foolishness. Foolishness is more than dishonesty. It's a lack of moral character and self-control. It's also the lack of personal responsibility. So look at verse 15. Laziness brings on deep sleep, and the shiftless man goes hungry. Now what we have here is a different kind of poverty. There are like two kinds of poverty in our world. Those without resources and opportunity are poor. They don't have resources and they don't have opportunity and a whole lot of our world, it lives in that kind of description. And then there's another kind of poverty. Those who foolishly neglect their responsibility to be productive and provide for their own and others. That's a poor man. But he's poor because of his own neglect, because of his own irresponsibility, because of his own laziness. I'm looking at verse 24. The sluggard, the lazy one, buries his hand in the dish of food. He puts his hand in the dish of food, and he won't even bring